So I am Frank, and I'm one of the longest living veterans diagnosed at 100%. I've been 100% disabled since the Vietnam Paris. That's 50 years now. I've been diagnosed with PTSD. I was diagnosed before it became PTSD. It was still Vietnam War syndrome, depressive neurosis, and we really didn't know what we were up against, really. And for lack of knowledge at the time, hey, join us. Sit right here. I'm trying to keep it tight. I'm videoing if that's okay with you.
Sure. Sorry to delay you here. Took a long week.
I graduated from high school in 1967, and I went right to fight during the height of the ground fighting during the Vietnam War. And I fought in the Tet Offensive, which was the bloodiest fighting of the war as far as the ground game was concerned. And we had lost in 1 month of fighting 5,000 Americans. To wrap your mind around that, it's more than Iraq and Afghanistan combined in 18 years. We lost in 1 month. That was a pivotal point during the war for soldiers, for veterans coming home, and America, because both sides really claimed victory. It was a military victory for the United States because we held off the onslaught on South Saigon, but it was a moral victory because there was no way that America, especially the parents of these young people, were going to stand by and have 5,000 of their children killed in 1 month without an explanation. And this started the anti-war movement. I came home and I struggled. I was severely shot. I was shot 7 times. I was doing search and destroy missions into Cambodia. I was the guy that jumped out of the helicopters and did things like that, the prototype of today's elite units. And I was shot. I was separated from my unit. I was on point. I was separated from my unit, and I was shot 7 times. And I was left there. And when they found me, they presumably thought I was dead and wrapped me up in plastic. I spent the next year of my life going in and out of hospitals and dealing with trying to put me back together physically. There was no psychological support at the time. There were no outreach programs. It's not like it is today. There was really nothing for veterans to come home to as far as helping us out to deal with our feelings and emotions. And I took morphine morning, noon, and night to survive, and I became addicted to drugs. And I began showing the symptoms of what later we know is PTSD, the anger, the rage, the self-denial. Mainly it was the first step always is self-denial and going through that. And so I started showing these examples, but I was still in the military. They didn't discharge me. Even though I was shot up so bad, the Army wanted me to fulfill my 2 years. They were under the mindset that if they started discharging all these soldiers, they'd have to compensate them with medical discharges, and they weren't about to do that. So they kept me in. I was sent to West Point, and I continued to do drugs, and I'm probably the only person ever to be busted for drugs at West Point, that dubious distinction. And I was sent to the stockade. I was sent to prison as an example because it was West Point. And this is what's happening with our veterans today. They're showing examples while in the military. They're showing signs of PTSD while they're still in the military. And our government is discharging them with less than honorable discharges. It's become a big problem. And this is what happened to me. I was actually discharged from the United States Army from a prison cell at Fort Dix Stockade and given a less than, we called it a dishonorable discharge. Now, protocol is less than honorable discharge. And I had that reversed, of course, because of my military duty. But the point is, we had this growing feeling of PTSD. This something is wrong. Of course, we didn't know. I'll refer to it as PTSD, but it wasn't at the time. we had this feeling that something was wrong. Now, of course, the sixties computers weren't invented then. Cell phones weren't invented then. There's a Vietnam veteran gentleman here, Ed, and we transcend all that by default, by our age alone. We didn't have cell phones and computers, so when you went in to talk to someone, the red flag went up on the page, literally, they put a red check. And soldiers like myself began to show these symptoms and these signs. Later on, to add to my trauma, after I was discharged with less than honorable, I went for a job with the Long Island Railroad. They turned me down because I have a bullet in my spine. I still have it today. It's actually in a vertebrae, but the Army, the military, didn't inform me that I had this condition. And then, again, these things that happened during our military duty follow us, and it's happened to a lot of young veterans today. Their military service followed them into civilian life, and that's exactly what happened to me. And then I found out I had a bullet. I continued with the drugs and alcohol. Several years later, during genetic testing for insurance for having a child, they found out I was contaminated Agent Orange. So I had two children born with birth defects, hearing impaired, auditory processing disorders. And again, this is something that I have to deal with, or I had to deal with as a veteran, that the military has no responsibility for. And that's kind of the fight that goes on between our government and our veterans today, is who is responsible for what. So I'm contaminated Agent Orange, and my children are learning disabled and with birth defects, and there's no connection. I can't make the connection. And this is the struggle with veterans, and this is what I advocate for, and I have been advocating for. There came a point after 2 decades of drug and alcohol abuse and these feelings of inadequacy and anger and rage, there came a point where in midlife I came to terms with my trauma, and I basically learned to embrace it. And that's what I talk to a lot of young veterans today, is try to embrace your trauma as opposed to fighting, because it's not going away. That's the main thing that they need to understand. I always, when I talk to young veterans, I identify as a PTSD survivor, because to go from that victim mentality to the survivor mentality is really the first step. They have to know that what they have is not going away. It's part of them. It's a human instinct. It's a human defense mechanism that is in all of us. It's inbred in mankind. And it's so hard to take that first step to veterans. And I don't know if you see this with your son. That first step is hard to step.
It took a while for him to say that he had a problem and
Right.
to go get help.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when you talk to him, and when, not just you, but in general, you have to understand to be a soldier, you can't go into battle feeling vulnerable. So, logically speaking, if you're going to survive, you're a gladiator. If you're going to survive and go into the military, and you have to feel invincible, you cannot feel vulnerable. It's how you survive. And our government and our military break us down, and they rebuild us with this mentality that we're invincible, because it's the only way to go into battle to survive. So that said, when you're discharged, you carry that mentality into your civilian life. You carry that invincible, mentality that, it's a defense mechanism. It's how we get through the day. Now, that said, how do you turn that around? How do you break that down and then go backwards and say, I have to reverse this now? You probably up against this. It's like you have to get through the brick wall. If you get up against it. Anybody jump in. If you guys, don't just listen to me. Please contribute. So that's the main obstacle I find when I talk to young veterans. So midlife, I began to realize that, okay, this is part of me now. Obviously, it's not going away. So I learned to embrace it, and I accepted PTSD. I accepted it as being part of me. And I began to find ways to work through it. My ways, and it's up at North Tonawanda High School now, is art. And I began creating artwork. And I began creating PTSD artwork. And I would tell stories, and I would begin to make paintings or sketch. And kind of each piece of artwork I created had a story behind it. And the story was always trauma. The story, I never painted a nice painting. It was never a landscape. It was always, a guy, like this, and, he really didn't look too well. And I just kept creating every day. I kept making artwork. And then, and I never showed it to anyone. That's kind of really important, because it was my own personal artwork. It wasn't meant for people to see. And I hid it away. I wouldn't let nobody find it. And of course, eventually it was found. I was dubbed the first closet artist of the Vietnam War. Another dubious distinction I have of being a closet artist. And I began to search out other veterans. This is 30 years ago. And I began to search out other veterans that were also creating art. And I found them. And I began collecting their art. And then it dawned on me. I realized what I had done. I had documented American history through art. And I'm going, wow, this is so cool. And then not only was I documenting American history, I was documenting, we were, as veterans, documenting the emotional history of our country through art. We were telling the story of PTSD as we know it today. And I thought this is the coolest thing ever. I thought I invented something, of course I didn't. Because it was always in us, but in my mind that had been so troubled for so long, I go, wow, this is the shit. I really got it going on now. And I went on the road, and I began to talk to people around the country, and I'm doing it for 30 years. And I talked to a lot of young people going into the military, and talking to them about the realities of the war. I'm going to be doing it Tuesday. I hope you all come to the lecture and the art exhibit. Talk to them about going into the military, about what they might face. And I believe in education before the fact, and I've been advocating for more reality-based education programs, and that's what you have in front of you. This year, I'm proud to say that we've actually initiated new curriculum. It's the first one in the country, called The Experience of the American Soldier. And it's not an extra curriculum. It's woven into American history. It's woven into government. It's woven into social studies classes. So it's not an extra curriculum for our teachers to handle. So in other words, when they come to World War II, when they come to the Battle of the Bulge, they'll spend not so much time on the battle, but a little more on the soldier that's in the battle. And learn who is that fighting in the battle. And through that, they'll learn about the battle. But they'll also learn about what is a soldier, what is a veteran. It's laying the foundation, especially for our future veterans that I speak to, and travel and do this around the country. And
That would have made social studies far more engaging to me.
no way, it's so simple, it's stupid.
Because I hated history because it seemed like all of history was battles
Yeah,
and
right.
dates, and it's like,
And
I was a
this,
committed pacifist since the time I was a
yeah,
kid. I don't
and-
want to hear about this.
Yeah, and every town in America has a veteran. He's sitting there in his home, just waiting for someone to knock at the door and say, hey, what'd you do? Tell us your story. They're all over, there's millions of them, they're all over the country. And I try to get schools to understand, just reach out to your local veteran, have him come in and integrate him into this story. Now, it starts at the Civil War. It starts with reading Civil War letters. So, for instance, in one of my last presentations, they read Civil War letters from soldiers, and then they read my letters from Vietnam. And they compared them. Same. At his home.
Actually, you can go back to the writings of the American Revolution.
Yeah, yeah,
Their writings are the same.
Yeah.
The same feelings, and you go back
yeah.
in the history, so.
Right.
We're all related in that same way.
Yeah, and the propensity of us as Americans to put ourselves in harm's way for whatever policy is, right? We have that propensity, we just keep doing it. Well, they were comparing on letters, said the same thing. I'm lonely, I'm scared, I wanna go home, I miss my family, I don't think I'm gonna make it. So they have that analysis, that's just one example. So this curriculum, it starts there, and it goes right up to the present wars. It's a win-win for both veterans and future veterans and education. It's reality-based, and we've gotten so far away from reality-based education in this country, in my opinion. We're worried about test scores, we're worried about how many people are getting into college, we're worried about, you know, I tell them, look, not every student is going to be a mathematician or a scientist, but every student is gonna face reality. Every student, whether it be war, they're gonna face trauma, they're gonna face some PTSD experience in their life. So students that I speak to, for example, next week at North Tonawanda, I'm talking to 18-year-old students and less, 17 and 18-year-old students. Well, we've been at war for more than 18 years. So we went to war before they were conceived. Now we're asking them to go into the military and experience horrific things. We're asking them to come home and be somewhat normal with these outreach programs and help them. On top of that, to add insult to injury, we're asking them to pay for the war for the rest of their working life. Literally, this is their war. It's their generation, it's their war. And they're gonna, like we paid for Vietnam for 50 years, we're still paying for it. You saw our outreach programs with Vietnam veterans. And so, we're asking these young people to go through this life. They're war babies, they were born during wartime, they grew up during wartime, now they're serving. And we're still not having a conversation with them before they do this, before they experience this. Well, I've been advocating for this for 30 years, and finally, I have it this year, and it's available to all school districts in New York State, and I will be advocating for it on my walk.
A lot of times what people usually bring up, initially when we came home, and I see this also with the Iraq and Afghanistan vets, as soon as they come home, they kind of isolate themselves. They get themselves into their own little thing. And a part of that is a little bit of the healing process. And that is that you have to adjust yourself to it. And I know a lot of people make the assumption that all veterans veterans, they're not going to talk. At their particular time of coming home and they're in that healing process, that maybe, you know, God only knows how long it is. It could be, for me, it was probably 25, 30 years. But at some point, you find comfort in telling your story. And for me, my thing has been do presentations on Vietnam and talk about it, but that brings it out. And I tell my story, the same as what he does with art. I have to do it with talk and study and things like that. But that is, all vets have to go through that healing process first. Then if they've been getting help, that process will help them to start talking, and then they'll be able to relate. And you do a little history, it seems like as we get older in life, it becomes more and more that we want to talk. The World War II vets didn't talk until probably into the 80s and into the 90s, okay, when they, all of a sudden they started talking about, and that was a generation, they never talk about it. Well, they didn't for a long time.
That was the
and
little,
then,
yeah, that was the flask in the lunchbox
Yes.
generation.
Yes.
You know, that was their way of dealing, and,
Right.
you know,
Well,
I know
go to
my father.
VFW and get drunk and, you know,
Yeah,
go home and beat
yeah,
up the
go
wife
to work
and
and
everything was
the
okay.
flask was in the lunchbox.
Right.
Well, this need to tell the story and this need to share, was that one of the functions that the VFW posts were supposed to serve?
I think they did. I think they did serve that, because they're talking to their others. Him and I can go over there and we could sit and talk for hours, but it's just between him and I. And we could shut out everybody else around us. But the important thing for us, at least, is that we're talking to you guys. We're telling some of our stories now out to you.
This is how we
That's-
move forward.
And that's how we move forward.
And-
Exactly.
And one of the reasons, the advocacy for having a veterans lounge on campus is that is the place where the student veterans can go, and Ed's been part of it. They can go up there and talk amongst each other and feel safe, because they can talk about things that would be inappropriate to talk about in your classrooms, or that they wouldn't feel safe about because of the way they would be judged. And you're absolutely right that shortly after I was hired, I had we had a student here, Kevin, and he was from the Vietnam War, and there was he was a Marine, and he was talking to another Marine who had just gotten out of the Iraq, and I walked up with my lunch, and Kevin got up and walked away, and Andy looked at me and said, I felt like I was talking to my brother, not someone old enough to be my grandfather. We were swapping stories, and the same crap he went through in Vietnam as a Marine, I went through in Afghanistan and Iraq. There was no difference. And so that, generations are connected in a millisecond
Yeah.
because of our bond as
Yeah,
veterans.
yeah.
There is no age difference. It's,
I work at Niagara County Veterans Court, and a mentor to returning vets that get in trouble. And usually this is when they're, either hooked on drugs in some form, or their PTS has gone off the chart, and stuff like that. And anyways, it's one of the reasons this court is successful. We've gone through, I think it's 63 veterans so far in our 5 years. And out of that 63, we've only had one case that is coming back through the system yet. One case out of all that time.
You were the first in the country, right?
At Buffalo was,
One
yeah.
for, yeah.
Yep.
Judge Russell.
Now.
Because
now
we
it's-
have it in Suffolk County and Long Island, we have the same court, I think it's modeled after yours.
Exactly.
And by coincidence, I'm headed there this afternoon.
Good, because that has been a tremendous type of thing. But to see these guys that come through, and once they start realizing that they're not alone in their problems, that there's other help, there is help, that they can get over it, and I'll tell you what, they become a real asset
Yeah.
to the community. In fact,
I know for me, the first step was,
Go ahead.
was that feeling I'm not alone. There's someone else out there, especially with the artwork. When I found someone creating artwork that was similar to mine, horrific artwork, as a means of release, it helped me to realize the big factor to get past was I'm not alone. There's someone else out there that feels the way I do, that is going through the emotional roller coaster that I'm going through, and can relate to what I'm saying. It's such a big step. I'm sorry.
I had a question
Yeah.
along the lines of this kind of sharing stories, but not so much among veterans and healing, as far as trying to represent accurate depiction of war to perhaps college students, high school students, just for informed citizenship, right? And then also perhaps people who might go into the military to have a sense of what war really looks like. And so, in a travel writing course I teach, I sometimes have a theme of war writing. So we'll read something like Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, or Kill Anything That Moves. But the problem I run into is, at least in published works, there's some level of, what's considered appropriate, what's considered polite to talk about. And so these published accounts of war narratives are just sanitized. There's so holding back on the real experience or the graphic nature of what goes on. And so I was wondering if you have any suggestions of texts that don't hold back.
One-on-one, I don't hold back. But we have in this country, there's a